r/ask Reddit. Historians of Reddit, what is the strangest chain of events you have studied? We learnt about this in school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch that people's homes were made of, and thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't, and the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Congressman Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served, but Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Edit: Crockett was in the House, not the Senate. Zengao Canal. So, the Han heard the kin were fond of mega projects and massive infrastructure investments, so they found a hydraulics engineer and sent him over to sell them on an absurd canal idea: build a massive canal to use runoff water from two flood-prone rivers to irrigate worthless plains. Tame the river's flooding, irrigate wasteland, everybody wins. And in the Han schemes, it's an absurdly large project that will keep the kin diverted and invested for decades. And it does. Except about halfway through, the kin cotton onto this and confront their hydraulics engineer, Zengao, presumably confronted with whatever creative thing or things they do to spies and saboteurs, throws himself on kin mercy. Yeah, I'm a spy. Yeah, it was to sabotage your efforts, but I'm really an engineer, guys, and this will really work, honest. Let me finish it, and please don't do that thing with the cheese grater. The kin, presumably, conclude they can always torture him to death later and let him remain in charge of the project. And wonder of wonders, it works. Thousands of hectares or rich but fallow desert are turned into fertile farmland. Existing farmland is made safer by giving the flooding rivers runoff channels. The canal makes the kin rich beyond their already immense wealth, which they turn to larger armies, eventually crushing the Han and, briefly, uniting China. That reminds me of the story of how a Chinese engineer named Zeman Bao proved religion is a con and abolished human sacrifice in China. Zeman Bao was an engineer and a rationalist who lived during the Warring States period in China. He served as a magistrate for the Marquis Wen, who ruled the territory of Wei from 445 BC 396 BC. During that time, the province of Yi, in what is now Hebei, began to decline and falter. The Marquis sent Zeman Bao to find out what was wrong. Zeman Bao visited the main town of Yi on the river Zhang. He was dismayed to find the fertile countryside depopulated. Whole families were fleeing productive farms and leaving the rich land fallow. The peasants feared the capricious god of the river, who could cause flooding and death, or alternately drought and starvation, but they feared the crushing taxes imposed upon them by the regional governor even more. Most of all, they feared a local witch who selected maidens from the area as brides for the river. Chosen girls were dressed in finery and tightly bound to sumptuously decorated floating platforms which were then sunk. These human sacrifice extravaganzas were the purported cause of the high taxes as well. The governor levied annual taxes for the ceremony and then kept a majority of the proceeds for himself and his cronies. People who complained discovered that their daughters were chosen as brides. Upon finding this out, Zeman Bao arrived at one of the marriage celebrations with a troop of Wei soldiers. As the ceremony started, he proclaimed the girl unworthy of the river god. He commanded the witch to go down to the riverbed and ask the river god whether the previous brides had been satisfactory. When she began to equivocate, the soldiers threw her into the river, where she quickly sank beneath the current. When the witch didn't return, Zeman asked the governor's cronies to see what was taking her so long. The soldiers then threw them in the river to drown as well. Zeman Bayo sarcastically suggested that the witch and the officials were having lunch with the river god. He was about to send the regional governor to fetch them when the governor fell to his knees and begged forgiveness for the scheme. Zeman Bayo stripped the governor of position and holdings and then probably tortured him to death as was customary at the time. He used the proscribed wealth to build a series of dams and irrigation canals to bring the unruly river under control. Zeman Bayo is still revered for being the first Chinese official to tame a river by means of civil engineering, cunning administration, and, above all, the ability to see that religion was a contrick. Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jeri Ryan gets cast on Star Trek Voyager as 7 of 9. Jeri Ryan divorces her husband. Her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jeri and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their split was Jack's desire to have sex in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out, and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This leads to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty Borg girl in their show. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was, so the government set up an American National Exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism vs capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro Khrushchev, chill out, have a Pepsi." Khrushchev must have loved that shit, because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s, when their contract was going to expire, and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a fuckton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company. As a boxing historian, probably the story of an ancient Greek boxer named Cleomedes. Apparently, while in the Olympic final, he killed his opponent by stabbing his fingers into his opponent's chest, killing him. Which means he loses due to a strange and awesome rule was, if your opponent was killed by the fight, he automatically won. So despite surviving the fight, Cleomedes is judged the loser. No glory or olive wreath. Returns home to Astypalaia and lapses into deep depression. Commits the first mass murder of schoolchildren after punching a support beam so hard the school fell down. All the kids die. Angry mob forms to kill Cleomedes, who takes shelter in a giant chest in the temple of Athena. Townsfolk storm the temple and try to pry open the chest, end up having to rip it apart board by board. But when they got it open, there was nothing in it. Naturally, the people didn't know what to make of it. So they sent people to the Oracle of Delphi, who declared that Cleomedes was the last true Astypalaian and that he be worshipped as a demigod. That is how an Olympic boxer became a deity of fertility after murdering a ton of kids. Royal family ain't got shit on ancient Greek crazy. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968, Lyndon Johnson is president, as a Democrat, and the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues, and they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft, and he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year, on Halloween, A Thursday, LBJ gets on the news and declares that the war is almost over and peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks and all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for one extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks and the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon, but barely. The war continued for another 5 years, and in that time 15k Americans died, as well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time, because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others, and felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of, even if it meant Nixon got away with treason. The absolutely amazing shenanigans of Edward Bernays was hired by American Tobacco Company to increase their sales. He staged a bunch of protests during an Easter Day parade by getting women to light cigarettes and hold them in the air and call them torches of freedom. Next thing you know, women are legally allowed to smoke. Also made the color green in season to promote Lucky brand cigarettes. Hired by Beeknet Packing, I think, to sell more of their product. Hired a couple doctors to produce these horribly skewed tests, and next thing you know, breakfast is the best meal of the day is born, and of course a hearty breakfast included bacon and eggs. Guess what Beeknet sells? Hired by Alcoa to find a way to get rid of their waste material. Pulls the same shenanigans as with the breakfast. Next thing you know, Alcoa is selling all their excess fluoride to put in our public water supply thanks to your dentist. And probably one of the craziest, he was hired by United Fruit Company to stage a coup on the new president of Guatemala. The president wanted to limit the fruit company's grasp on the country, of which the fruit company owned almost everything, and starved their people. He gets the president killed and starts a civil war. THST can still be felt to this day. This dude is the king of chain of events. This doesn't touch on all the crazy shit he did. From making women grow their hair out, to help hair nets sell, to making cups look like vaginas, so that people will be more inclined to buy Dixie cups. This man was an absolute genius at convincing people to do what he wanted. I just told this story on another sub, but the story of Arlington National Cemetery is a strange one indeed. Arlington Plantation, originally settled by none other than George Washington's adopted son, George Washington Parke Custis. He built the ornate mansion as a tribute to George Washington, creating a museum, or first presidential library. His heir Mary Custis married up and coming West Point grad, Robert E. Lee. During the Civil War, the Lees evacuated Arlington, and it was seized by the Union for unpaid taxes, a total of $91. Mary Lee had sent payment via courier, but the payment was refused as they wanted her to pay in person, which wasn't going to happen during the war. The Union began burying their war dead in Lee's front yard, so that every day Lee would be forced to realize the damage he'd done to his former country. After the war, the Lees sued the federal government in order to regain ownership of Arlington Plantation. The suit took many years to play out and ended in the US Supreme Court, favoring the Lees' complaint. The Lees has passed in the interim. The heir to the Lees estate, Robert E. Lee Jr., who actually had S brother named George Washington Custis Lee, had no interest in trying to re-establish the plantation at Arlington. Thousands of graves in the front yard may have been a deterrent. Therefore he offered to sell Arlington to the federal government, which accepted the offer. As luck would have it, then Secretary of War, now the Secretary of Defense, Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln, presented a check, about $100,000, to Robert E. Lee Jr. to settle the matter once and for all. How's that for a Reconciliation Act and beginning of reconstruction of our union? The white collars from the port case in Peru, that is still ongoing. It has landed former presidents, current political power holders and many public servants to jail. Many congressmen and women are shaking, knowing they will be next once their parliamentary immunity runs off. Thing is, one day two idiot drug dealers decided to have a shootout in the streets of Callao, which is a port city embedded inside Lima, the country's capital city. The place is highly contested by drug dealers, since the port facilities are the main exit point for large drug shipments. Obviously, this being Peru, everything is corrupt as fuck. So a small, but brave and honest, group of police officers and district attorneys start investigating this shootout and casually obtain wiretap judge orders for the suspects of the drug dealing organization. And lo behold, a lot of judges and politicians were in the payroll of these drug dealers. But that was not the funny part. That would be the fact that the wiretapping orders were expanded, and in the end they ended up finding out the top judges in the country did favors in exchange for ridiculous things. One of them asked for an iPhone for her daughter and tickets to see the national soccer team play. This guy also was asked to let a guy walk free who had raped a 14-year-old girl, and his response was, "What do you want? Reduced sentence? Go free." He can be heard on the audio discussing how much rape did the girl get, and speaking of it as if it was nothing. These top judges control which judge gets sent to which court. Obviously, most of our politicians, being real corrupt fucks, have lots of ongoing court cases. No surprise to find among the recordings that these top judges negotiated with a lot of politicians to arrange favors. This has caused a chain reaction of people being investigated and jailed, politicians and members of the justice system. It has confirmed what everyone suspected for years, that the justice system in Peru only works if you have money and or known people inside. Also, bonus track, some journalists have been linked to these corruption rings thanks to these audios. Currently the Congress, which is the most corrupt and useless one in decades, is scrambling to keep the judges accused of corruption from going to prison, while keeping the president from making reforms by obstructing laws. Everyone and their mothers are ducking for cover because they know that the evidence against is mounting so damn fast that the usual tactics no longer work for these politicians. So, thanks to this and the Odebrecht/Lava Jato case, we might finally find some justice for these corrupt politicians that have been treating us like idiots for the past 30 years. And all because two idiot drug dealers wanted to see who had the biggest dick by shooting each other. The 80-Year War, commonly known in the rest of the world as all the shit that happened before the 30-Year War, was the Dutch struggle for independence. Due to typical medieval fuckery, the King of the Netherlands wasn't some Dutch guy, but Philip II of Spain. Slight problem, the Dutch provinces were major centers of Protestantism, which was kind of awkward for the staunchly Catholic Philip. Trying to impress, that fact led to a rebellion, and it turns out that fighting swamp people on their own turf can get really messy. The entire war was full of crazy shit, and saw the Dutch Republic go from a bunch of pirates on riverboats to one of the most powerful empires of the day. The entire thing didn't go well for Spain, but one of the most downright crazy things were the Helberners. The Spanish held Antwerp, and one crazy plan we don't like to talk about failed. That was the Finbellis, a ridiculously expensive littoral combat vessel/siege platform that, in true form to ships named through hubris, was incapable of doing what it was designed for. But there was another plan. The British, in support of their Protestant brethren, had hired an Italian inventor to help the rebels. This man came up with a simple, but batshit crazy plan: make two giant floating bombs, and use them to blow up the ship bridge preventing entry to Antwerp. These were the Helberners, two cargo vessels that were modified with a huge blast chamber in the hold. It consisted of brick walls filled with gunpowder, closes off with headstones on top. This was surrounded by all manner of shrapnel. One used a traditional fuse, while the other used a novel clockwork fuse. When they were deployed against the ship bridge, they were set alight as normal fireships. One ran aground, while the other struck its target. Initially, the Spanish response was dismissive. Converting normal ships to fireships is something people only did in extreme times of need, and there were only two of them. Soldiers rushed to put out the fire, and they thought that would be it. Then these motherfuckers exploded. The blast killed 800 Spanish on the spot and obliterated the bridge. But as so often happens with experimental military technology, the rebels weren't expecting quite this success and failed to capitalize on it. The Spanish held Antwerp, would hold on to the Spanish Netherlands, which would eventually become Belgium. But the story doesn't end there. Soon after, the Spanish embarked on a little trip you might have heard of, La Armada Invincible. Clearly, they had not learned a lesson of their success against the Finbellis. The purpose of the Armada was to land troops in England, show them who's boss, and knock them out of the war. This wasn't a crazy idea, as the British land forces were kind of shit. Of course, what followed was a successful naval action of the British against the Spanish, and one of the most resounding naval defeats in history. However, the opening volley of the battle was quite desperate. The British converted old cargo ships to fireships and launched them at the Spanish fleet, which was in close formation. The Spanish fleet promptly scattered and was picked apart. Nobody really knows for sure, but the fact that the Spanish had just had a large amount of ships obliterated by a super weapon that looked exactly like what the British fleet deployed, which they knew was built by someone in service to the British Crown. Well, that's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? Edit. This is all from memory, so if I fuck it up, please forgive me. One of my favorites explains why the solid rocket boosters for the space shuttle were designed around the width of a Roman horse's ass. So Rome made the roads and the roads grew ruts in them. Ruts created by the standard Roman war chariot at a width of 4 feet 8 1/2 inches. The Roman chariots were designed to fit the wheels in such a way that 2 horses could pull the chariots and wagons abreast to each other, and the wheels not sit directly in the horses' hoof prints. As Europe grew, it continued to use the old roads with the old ruts, so to keep their wagons from breaking less, they were designed to fit the old Roman ruts. So a 4 foot 8 1/2 inch axle. When rail lines were developed in Europe, they were made to match the original axle size of the wagons, as the tools to make this size wagon already existed, and it was only a matter of changing the wheel itself to make a basic rail car. When trolleys and simple rail came to the US, it was originally designed by experienced European craftsmen, so it too was designed with the standard 4 foot 8 1/2 inch axle. As the US rail system grew, it passed through mountains which had tunnels cut through them to fit the trains that ran on the rails as they passed and turned. So that brings us to the SRBs and the space shuttle. The SRBs were designed by a company called Thiokol and built in a factory in Utah, then shipped by rail to Florida. This meant the SRB's width had to be planned to fit through these tunnels that the rails passed through the mountains, which were designed to match the European rail line standards, which were based on carts that had to match the old Roman roads, which were rutted by chariots that were designed to fit the width of a horse's ass. And that is the connection between the width of an old Roman horse's ass and the US space program. Rise of Islam. So it started as an old man Muhammad who claimed to have got a message from God. He starts preaching and gets thrown out of the city for heresy. He moves to another where people are accepting. However, he got stuck in there for years. Eventually, after a series of wars and battles, Muhammad conquers and enslaves most of tribes in Arabia, creating the first united Arabic state. However, while this was going on, in the north, Byzantine and Persian empires have fought a series of wars which lasted for decades. These wars totally devastated the landscape, leaving it depopulated and very poor. This situation allowed this Arabic state, a very obscure and negligible tribal confederation, to conquer entirety of Middle East, completely absorbing the Persian Empire and conquering 70% of Byzantine Empire, practically unopposed. If these events had not transpired in such fashion, then Islam would most likely remain an obscure and minor religion focused primarily in Arabia, and Middle East would remain majority Christian and Zoroastrian. Now that would be an interesting alternate history to see. Zhang Zhangchang, the dog meat general. Literally anything about his life is interesting as hell. He was the Chinese warlord of Shandong in the early 20th century. Zhang Zhangchang proved to be one of the more capable warlord generals, making effective use of armored trains manned by experienced White Russian mercenaries. He recruited up to 4,600 white Russian refugees from the Russian Civil War, from which he formed a regiment, complete with faked tsarist uniforms and all the bells and whistles. He was also one of the first Chinese generals to incorporate women into the military on a large scale, including using a regiment of nurses consisting entirely of white Russian women. He had so many concubines that he stopped referring them by name and assigned each of them a number. After winning a battle by making his enemy's forces defect, he rewarded the defectors by allowing them to keep their original ranks. He then promoted his own officers, but since there was not enough metal to make the gold and silver stars for their rank insignia, he ordered the stars to be made from the gold and silver paper foil in cigarette cartons. During the mass promotion ceremony, the officers were surprised to find their insignia already torn even before the ceremony had ended. During one of his campaigns, he publicly announced he would win the battle or come home in his coffin. When his troops were forced back, he was true to his word, was paraded through the streets, sitting in his coffin and smoking a large cigar. He also wrote poetry. Here's some. Someone asks me how many women I have. I really don't know either. Yesterday a boy called me dad. I don't know who his mother is. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.